I increasingly see a language of decision making, and I'm guilty of that. I've used it before, and it never really fit. It never made sense, and it's because we're not talking about decision making. It's not a decision if you don't have different options to choose from. It's not a decision if you haven't had uh the background in something, the opportunity in something, and I think that in a way, even talking about decision making does that work of individualizing it even further. But one person who was listening to it, we asked for their reflections to note them down afterwards. And they described people as having humble dreams. They were quite taken aback. And, these are not young people who are dreaming to be influencers or to be celebrities or sports stars. These dreams they describe to me as being humble. And that is one of the values of doing research and kind of having conversations and making it public and engaging with people, because it's not just a case if you putting it on people, you get feedback too, what other people see and hear. So for me, it felt very meaningful that somebody had engaged with those stories and had felt that about it. And it really kind of provided a language to capture something that I was struggling with.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Jeoffrey Sarpong podcast. My guest today is Dr. Sarah Mary Hall. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Professor Professor Sarah Mary Hall is a professor in human geography at the University of Manchester. She's also the lead researcher in the Austerity and Altered Lives project, which I've kind of found out about her through that project. And I was so fascinated to have her on this podcast today. She's a researcher on foreclosed futures, humble dreams, and the quiet economics of everyday family life. This conversation for me is an attempt to kind of give that framework for people living through it, especially my generation, who feel like they've been caught in the austerity program without really understanding why. So, Sarah, welcome again.
Oh, great. I was so pleased when you got in touch, Jeffrey. Really looking forward to having this conversation with you.
So, okay, let's get straight into it then. So, first off, we spend years listening to young people talk about their futures. What has surprised you the most?
I think what surprises me the most, I mean, I've never failed to be surprised and awed by the people who are generous enough to give me their time and open a window into their lives a bit. I think what maybe doesn't surprise me so much, but I think maybe could surprise the research community a bit more, is just how articulate young people are about their lives and their futures. For so many years, I remember giving talks about and sharing some of the findings from the work, and there'd always be someone who put their hand up and say, "Oh, but is this political?" And I wanted to say, yes, come and listen and engage with what young people talk about their futures. So whether it's work I've done following youth campaigns on Brexit, whether it's projects like ours now, where we listen to people talk about what they imagine of their future, whether it's people who are experiencing or at the very forefront of, large economic change and smaller regional economic change like devolution. I think what I'm always kind of like nicely surprised by and reminded of is that young people are very articulate about it. And I don't mean that in a patronizing way, and I'll explain what I mean. It's the ability and the foresight to very much link a broader economic system to their own lives. And I think that's often something that I can get criticized as a researcher. Or how do you know it really is this? Actually, because young people are telling us that it is. Young people can recognize that very quickly, that relationship between these big changes and what it means on the ground for them, for their friends, for their family.
And I think, yeah, a large part of that is what I want to kind of touch on. I myself, I'm part of this kind of age group. And so I feel this very much, my lived experience. And so I'd love to kind of get into the study and kind of understand how it relates to my own experience and see if there's any connection there. But before we get into that, I want to take a little step back and talk about how you got into this study and like your research journey up until this moment. You've said before that, you're coming kind of from a working class background, but you become a professor. what was that journey like? How much of that background informed your research?
How long have you got? um, yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, I think it's really hard to disentangle the two, to be honest. I've been working on a book recently, which has been definitely a labor of love and the rest of it. And kind of one of the realizations I had when I was writing it was that over the time of me becoming a researcher, so doing a PhD, working at universities for a long time. So I've been at my present at the University of Manchester at the moment, and I'll have been there 14 years by the end of this year. And that really still surprises me. But in that time, I've also witnessed a lot of economic change in my own life. And I think so I think that my background affects a lot of things. I think where I'm from, so I'm from a Barnsley, which is a former mining town, and I grew up literally my house overlooked a coal heap, which is like the remains of the mining industry. And that's what I saw out of our house every time we left. And, over the years, I've seen huge changes in that area um my family through these very sharp austerity years, losing some family members, which I'm pretty certain is because of health related and welfare related cuts. And then now when I look at that landscape, it's actually been flattened, and the local council put the biggest delivery warehouse on there. So the delivery company, now has its biggest European dispatch unit there. And for me, there's a story there about that. I think as well that there's a kind of a saying often in a lot of feminist work that the personal is political. And I think that's very much the case for me, um, that whether it's understanding how capitalism is being refined through neoliberalism in our country, those recession and austerity years, they hit while I was doing my PhD. I was doing a PhD on how families make ethical decisions, how they make ethical choices that aren't just about so-called ethical products, but are about taste and preference and thrift and frugality and class. And I was doing a project then when the recession hit, and kind of seeing it through that lens. So for a long time now, I think I've realized that has been my big interest, how economic change is lived in everyday life. But like I say, I think it's also because perhaps in some ways I do embody a lot of privilege. Like you say, I'm a professor at a university. Um, I, I English is my first language. I was born in this country. I'm white. There's a lot of privilege that I embody in this position. But I think my work and maybe my own identity show that it can be a lot more nuanced than that. Um, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, I think also kind of like to speak about that kind of working class to kind of academia pathway. I think like, from for me, even though I'm not in academia, I have gone to uni, did my master's, so I kind of been around the academia side when I kind of work in that space now. I've seen that like it does tend to have a certain people from a certain background. People whose parents have also gone through the same process. And so that kind of it brings a perspective when it comes to studies or what choose to be focused on is things that they're interested in. That's why it's so important for people like you to be in these kind of communities because it fosters these kind of studies where we're trying to understand people who maybe aren't as as out there or aren't as visible, and I think that's why I'm really fascinated by this. So we talked about that, like how you kind of were studying in economic change. What led you to this foreclosed future study? What was the I guess inspiration for it?
yeah. Thank you for asking that. I think there was kind of a period of sort of following the thing that I was felt very interested about, and maybe I wasn't necessarily at the sharp end of living, but those around me were. So, in 2012, I started a project that was kind of on the right off the bat of austerity policies in the UK. And so the way that originally it was the conservative Lib Dem government, and then it was the Conservative government who continued these direct cuts that were made to the public sector, so welfare, education, health, care services, especially, and local government. And the argument was that that was to pay off a national debt. So this idea that these services and these people who are most reliant on them can forego because this national debt is more important. And it's set out to look like it's a very rational argument, but it is an incredibly political decision. It's not the only way that you can pay off a national debt. There are other ways to raise revenue through taxing corporations and so on. Lots of other places have done it differently. But in the UK and in other parts of Europe, there was this austerity policies that were taken on. And so I'd been carrying out projects, long-term projects that were embedded with people in the lives they wanted to show me for many years at that point. So I've been researching austerity and recessions, started doing work around Brexit and devolution around 2016. So Brexit vote and the kind of aftermath. And also at a similar time, and these debates ended up being really interestingly tied together, this Brexit because we want this local devolution. I won't get into that now. So those devolution debates in the UK were playing out. Greater Manchester was the first place to devolve. So I was kind of watching these economic changes happening, and the people that I was spending time with and listening to were sharing what was happening for them. And in that 2-year ethnography I mentioned before, the families were saying to me, actually, we always thought we were going to have another child and we can't. And at that point, you often might think it's anecdotal, but actually I noticed they were talking about their friends being in the same position and so on. And so it's something I started to kind of watch around. And there's this big European report that comes out. They have reports all the time from Eurofound and Eurostat, these big policy companies across Europe, policy commissions, sorry. And I was reading these reports about how many more young people are living at home than ever before, and how the markers of independence were kind of a bit later in life, but how that has a very direct link to the choices that people feel they can and can't make or have access to upon having children. So that particular issue was something that I'd become very interested in. But my argument would be that that is not the only form of reproduction. So we reproduce the everyday in all manner of ways through cooking and cleaning and caring, and we reproduce it by thinking about and desiring better and more. But having children can also be part of that. And it's just really interesting how the economic situation for many people across Europe, so the areas we work in Europe include Spain, Italy, Ireland, and the Netherlands, as well as the UK, but also colleagues who are working in other countries, including Greece and France, are reporting that everyday economic conditions are having such an impact on the most intimate decisions that people make in their daily lives.
Yeah, and I think, to speak a little bit more about that study, I think it was over 100 young people across those countries that you mentioned. And, I think one of the stuff that I saw that young people were constantly talking about, that there was nothing to hold on to regarding the futures. And I think that idea of people coming into the economic process, coming into, adulthood, realizing that there's nothing they can there's no direction, is something that I feel. And again, to make it kind of anecdotal, my friends also talk about it. I think that's what kind of really drew me into this kind of conversation, because I realized that, again, I was surprised someone was out there doing a study about something that goes so intimately about my life, that it was a quiet part that I was just, because there was no answers to it, it was very hard to kind of gauge. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you found when you're talking to these people, when you're talking to these young people? What was that like?
Yeah. So the project you're referring to is kind of the one that came off the back of that reproduction project, the Austerity and Altered Life Courses project. And yes, you're very right. We've collated what we call oral histories and futures from over 100 people across the UK, Spain, and Italy. And the idea of foreclosed futures, it really kind of is a bit of a pushback at this idea that people are making decisions and acquiring independence later in life. And we're actually finding people are saying, no, we're not having it at all. With that project, we had a very particular idea that we would research people aged 18 to 35. And the reason for that was that at that age, People would have had their kind of most formative years of living, their childhood and their youthhood and early adulthood in austerity. So that was the idea for that. And we were not surprised, but it was quite telling how many people contacted us and said, actually, I'm between 35 and 40, but this is my life too. This is what I'm experiencing as well. And this real sense of an intergenerational shift. One of the things that we've really kind of noticed with our work is, first of all, this idea of foreclosed futures. So the paths, the options, the decisions that young people once thought were available to them, whether it's their education or employment opportunities, whether it's independence in terms of their housing, isn't happening. More and more people are sharing houses than they expected. More and more are in precarious jobs compared to the careers they might have imagined. Many don't have the income or the family wealth to be able to access higher forms of education too. So you're seeing that these things are all kind of, they layer in and they're playing out at the same time. One of the things that's kind of really interesting is the similarities that people experience across different places. That yes, there might be very different reasons why that's happening in a particular country, and austerity has different colours and textures to it, but the way that it ends up kind of being expressed in people's lives can be remarkably similar. And the other thing that we found is that, like other studies, yes, we have noticed there's a sense of there being an intergenerational difference. So young people often talk about their lives and their futures in a relational way. And by that, I mean they're comparing them. And they're comparing them often to their parents' generation or their guardians' generation, comparing them to their own ideas of where they thought they'd be. So there's this like comparing it to yourself. But the other thing we see that's really vital, and this is really growing, is an intra-generational difference. So that's a difference that young people are experiencing between them and their peers. And we also see that happening on a national and global scale, that the gap between the most well-off and the least well-off is growing all the time. And young people can really feel that, even in friendship groups and in, yeah, like I said, peer groups. So I think that's also really interesting for how we think about how you literally imagine your future, because the way that we do it is often it's anchored to something, right? It's anchored on or hooked on dreams or ideas or the things you see other people doing. But if you don't see that, or you see it and you know that, well, they've got housing independence because they come from a family that's got got some money behind them that can support you, but you have no hammock underneath you. No one's catching you. I think that has a real effect on how and if people can dream.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you've said so many beautiful things. I want to kind of take it step by step and really take our time here, because I think this is really like touching on the crux of the issue for me. So you mentioned obviously there were some similarities and differences across Europe. Can you talk to me a little bit more about what you found? What were some of the stuff that was similar in these countries or different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the first hand, you have cultural differences and expectations. So without wanting to stereotype, I'll say that at the front, that in particular in parts of Southern Europe, there are different expectations around family, and you often find that people were moving out of the family home later anyway. And part of that is cultural, part of it is about expectations around care within families. Part of it can be gendered in that way. So a lot of younger women might stay at home to look after family and then move out to look after their own families that they have. And part of it is also related to education. So in particularly in the part of Italy where we're researching in Sardinia, it's quite common for young people to go to their local university and stay living at home. So migrating for university, even within a country, the way that happens most often in the UK, that's not the same kind of expectation. But in particular in Southern Europe, so we still notice changes in when people felt like they could be or would expect to feel independent in that way, in terms of where they live and who they live with. Climate change came up an awful lot more, and I imagine that's because of a sense of one experience in extreme heat the last few years, and the effects of that. There were also very extreme flooding. There was extreme flooding that happened in Spain when we were doing some of the field work. And these, skyrocketing heats. So I think there's an idea and a reality of an exposure to climate change too.
Yeah.
And I think in the UK as well, there's for a lot of young people, there's a real sense of an understanding that the government often, the state, and often right-wing politicians have this idea that everyone wants to come here for immigration. And that's not the idea. People aren't coming because they think this is a great place to live. They're coming often because they have family connections, and there's another connection there. So for a lot of young people who took part in the project, whether they were from migrant families or not, there's kind of a sense that, this is not the country that maybe some people think it is. This is not the place where you have ease of access to a job or welfare or housing. These things feel really out of reach. So that's where we're kind of seeing those differences there. And then as we're starting to do more research in Ireland and the Netherlands, we also see it playing out slightly differently there. So one of my colleagues in the Netherlands describes it as being like the Netherlands kind of being a bit behind maybe where the UK is now, and a feeling of young people struggling with some of these elements. And in Ireland, it's actually been for a longer period. So parts of Ireland were particularly impacted by the global financial crisis. So that impacted their housing market in a very specific way. So you've got these cultural differences, you've got these economic differences, but I would say despite all that, you actually find a lot more similarity between.
I think that's so fascinating. I think there's an element of like, it feels kind of, I don't feel alone, or my generation doesn't feel alone to understand this is something across Europe, because it tends to feel like it's something just really aimed at us. And, we think about migrating, we think about going other places. But yeah, I think it's a generational thing we're feeling across Europe. On that point that you talked about intergenerational, or like us comparing ourselves to another generation, but what we thought we would be to another generation's actual reality. Can you talk a bit more about that? What did you find when people talked about them comparing themselves to when you thought?
Yeah. So it was interesting because we didn't deliberately ask questions about that, but because our method is about, we ask people to share through their own narrative about their life and about their future, and we use creative techniques too. So we use postcards and essays and photos and things that kind of give you a space to talk about the future that isn't just words. Because like you beautifully said, this stuff is heavy, it's hard, you're experiencing it day to day, and it's not always that easy to kind of grasp it. And we feel that too as researchers. So oftentimes when we asked young people about their future or the imagining, they would say, at this point in my life, I thought I'd have this, but now I'm here, I think it's going to be this. And I find that really fascinating, asking and having a bit of access to, and people being wonderfully generous in sharing how their idea of the future has changed over time, because that's really important. That in research isn't just a snapshot of a moment, that we're capturing something else. But when they did talk about that, they often said, well, at my age, my parents had this, this, and this. And what was funny, not haha funny, but uncanny, was that they were comparing the same things. Having kids, or thinking of having a family, housing independence, whether renting their own home, or in the UK, there's more of a culture around home ownership, which again is a difference, and employment, so the stability of employment. And there's often this language of no longer can you have a job that's for life. And I don't think it's a case of necessarily young people romanticizing the past, because we do know now there are more precarious jobs, there are fewer houses. Housing now takes up somewhere between a third and half, if you're lucky, of your income to pay for that, whereas it used to be closer to about 10%, 15%. So there's this comparison. There's often been an academic work on young people. There's this really interesting discussion that's happened around life courses. So we and our project use a language of life course rather than life transition, because that kind of suggests that there should be these stages. And what I find interesting is that even when we don't apply the idea that there should be stages, when we give a more kind of rounded view, that is still what people measure their lives by. It's still kind of an expectation. And I think that's where I find that hard, because I don't think as researchers or policymakers, we have the right to say, oh, you shouldn't be expecting the same as the generation before you, or don't expect the same as your friend, because only he can afford it. So I think that there's something there for me about, we can critique all we like, that people might measure their success in life by these stages, because that is what's framed, that's what you've learned from being young.
Absolutely. And I think also there's an element of like when you get to a certain stage in your life, when you, for example, you finish uni, there's a period where you look at your life and you judge that, you judge how well you're doing based on where you are in relation to those stages.
Yeah.
And so if you feel like, okay, I finished uni, I'm in work, but I'm nowhere near getting a house, you feel behind. And I think that definitely has a sense of, it makes you feel like you maybe should change something in your life. It affects how your mood is. So I think these things really, like, even though we try not to be so kind of rigid with these stages, even like me amongst my friends, we always talk about it. We say, oh yeah, but you can't compare yourself to another generation, there's different things, there's so much external communications about the situation, but internally it's very hard for us to kind of, make it, to have an understanding about it. I think that's why conversations like this are so important, because it gives us the context of
Yeah.
what we're living through.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think that's it, isn't it? It's about acknowledging what it actually feels like day to day, but then also being able to have conversations or see things that say to you, you're not on your own. It's shitty. It's not your fault. Even though I think a neoliberal world tries to tell you that you haven't done enough, you've not worked hard enough, fast enough, strong enough to do it, we know that it's structural. But that's hard, isn't it? Because if you're in that position, hearing, oh, it's structural, it's all the things you can't control. We did a piece of work with our project where we invited people who'd taken part in the work, we invited our research partners, we invited local policymakers, academics, activists together in each of the sites for a discussion about our findings. And we shared them, but we also tried to come up with some collective solutions. And if it's useful, I can share it with you, that we have like a little guide on how do we face the future in these austere contexts. And the third one is thinking about concentrating on hope without the hype. So having a sense of, yes, there is hope, and perhaps that comes in connecting, solidarity, having a sense of understanding that your decisions aren't decisions because you don't have control over them, but without the hype of all the expectations that can be placed on you.
I thought, can you talk a little bit more about that? I think that's fascinating. The kind of the solutions to the problem that
Mm.
I think our generation is kind of thinking about now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's for me as an individual to give a solution, because I'm not in that position. But I think what absolutely is important for research to do that explores this is to provide the space, the mechanisms, the resources to enable people to gather to do that. And it's interesting you should ask me about kind of being solution or hope driven. So one of the changes that I've made recently is that in expanding the Austerity and Altered Life Courses project to the Netherlands and to Ireland, it really got me thinking about the method that we'd use. And this oral histories and futures method had so much value to it, for us as researchers, bearing in mind that throughout the project, this amazing research team were often experiencing the same things that people were talking about. So, I think there's an element of that too, was recognizing where it's not the same situation, but recognizing where there might be parallels. What I did start to think about was, we had these individual interviews and we might have invited people to take part in things. So people were invited to the event I mentioned before. They were invited also to take part in a playwriting sessions where we've got a co-produced play that's been written with participants' stories. But as a team, we did a lot of connecting, discussing, maybe even having coaching or therapy, or really working through some of these connections between personal life and the stories of the people we've been listening to. I kind of had this feeling of, I feel like the work needs to do that more. So rather than having individual oral histories and futures, what we're actually going to experiment with now is having those discussions in a group setting and orienting them more towards collectivizing together. And it might not be that it would form a group of people, but it being in a space and being able to share some of these experiences as much as you feel comfortable with, and acknowledging that others in that space are there and what are they doing and how do they see it and what's their positioning on it, I think could do a lot of good. Because I was going to say to you, Jeoffrey, what's really interesting to me is when we were first chatting about this and today, like your reaction of, oh, that's me too, because we hear that a lot. We've had a lot of people when they agree to take part, when we ask them why, they say, I didn't know someone was studying this and this is my life.
Yeah, no, I think just on 2 points. I mean, when you first said about just kind of being part of that community, I think it's so important. And I work in kind of community spaces and the more creative sphere, and I see the same kind of parallels where people will come there, not expecting them to find someone who relates to them and then have that relation. And it gives you a sense of, it gives you a language for your identity almost. And I think in this kind of thing, I think it kind of having a language around it helps to understand that, like we keep saying, it's not just you. You're not alone because, you said it before. I think there is an element of the environment. It'll keep telling you that you're not working hard enough, and that's why you're behind, or like you're not doing something, you're doing something wrong, and that's why you're not getting to these stages. Yeah, but I think once you understand that, it's actually, it's more of a larger thing. Austerity is involved, and there's all these kind of futures, and there's economic factors, which is, before your time. It gives you some sort of context. And I think that's why I wanted to kind of get into this conversation and give a little bit of that context. We've talked a lot about austerity, but we've not kind of defined it and explained it for someone who doesn't understand it. Could we go there a bit? Like, what is austerity and like how did it affect my generation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So earlier when I mentioned what austerity was, I actually missed an important bit out, so I'm glad you asked. So austerity kind of has the two definitions that I think really interconnect. So one, if you flip open a dictionary, it will tell you that austerity is the cutting public expenditure to pay off a state debt. So it's where a national government is indebted, in this case, indebted to the international community, and needs to pay it off in order to settle its finances. I could go on forever about how it's not like a household finance, the way that it's talked about, but I won't. So that's kind of the basic idea. And to do that, it would cut the things that it spends money on. So it would cut things like, all the public services. There's a political choice about which ones they cut. And then austerity is also described as a condition of severe simplicity and self-restraint. So it is also acknowledged as being like a personal condition of cutting back. And the language of austerity, when it first began to be used, really kind of leaned on these wartime narratives about, all coming together for the good of a nation, coming together to make sure that that you're living within your means, that you can, that your government is getting by, that the food goes to those who need it, all these ideas, but actually they didn't really play out so well from the 2008 onwards, because that's not the reality we're facing. And that the austerity from wartime was followed by a massive prosperity boom, right? We talk about the boomer generation, and that's because of the experiences they had, the things they had access to, the culture, the life for many people, not everyone. But that's not where we are now. So our period of austerity hasn't experienced this huge boom afterwards. It's actually slid. So the way I approach austerity is kind of trying to keep those two things, holding them. But I also look at it as everyday austerity. I look at it through a lens of everyday life, and particularly through friendships, family, and what I call intimate relations. So the way that through my work, the way I look at it, I understand how austerity is shaped everyday relationships in all sorts of ways. So it can create extra bonds, but it can also create extra tensions. I mentioned before about intra-generational differences. So we see tensions emerging in friendships, tensions emerging between generations. And it also can impact the everyday things that someone can do and that they can afford about and dream. There's one effect that's often in the news that comes out a lot. It's called the lipstick effect. And that's the lipstick effect is where when people don't have access to as much resources, they still want to have little treats where they might buy a lipstick or perfume or something small. And I think while those narratives are really important to be in media, a recognition that this is a big thing impacting on someone's life, I don't think it really captures the whole breadth of it. You know, I've seen people spending so much of their time and energy selling secondhand things to be able to afford to buy shoes for September for school. I've seen people getting up after feeding the kids after school, after possibly a long day at work, a long commute, and going out at 10 p.m. to go to the food aisle to see what's been reduced that day that can go in the sandwich boxes the next day. I think the things that we miss are the things that make up our everyday life, our relationships, the things we do, the people we care for. And austerity has, in my view, fundamentally reshaped those social elements in our lives. Does
Yeah,
that, I
it
mean,
makes it
without wanting
makes
to ask too much, does that ring true for you?
absolutely, and I'm nodding my head because like it does really kind of go along with my kind of life experience. You know, obviously I think we spoke about before. I come from a kind of very much working class background. I was born in Ghana. My family came in when I was 6 years old. So we came into an area which isn't kind of, affluent, and they very much kind of like, difficult upbringing. And I always thought that was just normal. And so there was stuff you mentioned, and selling secondhand stuff to buy school clothes, or, going into the aisle and getting like cheaper stuff. I just thought that was normal until a little bit of that intergenerational kind of comparison. I got to a certain age and I looked at my friends were saying, no, we didn't do that. Obviously, they had different upbringing, and there were certain friends who had similar, but it was very much that, oh, okay, like there is a difference. And I like think when my parents came here, they came here in search of more of a stable life, and so I was too young to understand the change. But as I got older, I realized what they were looking for was a more of a life with all these kind of things that would come easy. And I think austerity, or the idea of austerity, has been a language in my life for so long, but I've kind of attributed in the second sense, where it's like, stripping back discipline and all of these things because of just my environment. I had to do that. And so it's very much interesting to see that there is a trickle effect from economics into the personal. And you obviously the lipstick that you talk about, the lipstick effect. Or I remember it in the first conversation we had, we talked about choosing which fabric softener to get, or like all these different. Can you talk a little bit more about how it kind of affects on a more
Yeah,
personal level?
absolutely. I mean, the best thing I can do as well is to direct people to our digital exhibition. So we're using 12, so with the over 100 stories we had, we picked out 12, four from each country that we felt really kind of encapsulated a lot of the stories that we heard from people during our project. And so they're on an online exhibition that I'll share a link with you for. And you can listen to those stories, you can listen to people talk about their lives. And the things that really strike me are when um and this is where the humbleness comes from that we might talk about, that people talk about one day in life being able to afford a better fabric softener, getting older and still having all your teeth, um, being able to afford to put petrol in the second-hand car you've been able to afford. So a lot of people don't talk about a big thing. They talk about, being able to afford your heating and energy bills. These are things that in one person might see as a basic right. And actually, these are the dreams that a lot of young people have. And I think the other thing I was going to say was that I don't think we often connect this enough either, which is the feeling for a lot of young people of being isolated in these issues and not knowing it if it affects others, is because austerity has the effect of isolating people, and it does it very well. So it individualizes the problem to a person or a group of people that might be related, right? So household or family of choice. It isolates that to you. So you feel it on a day to day. But the condition of austerity, that means you might not be able to go out more, connect. You don't have the energy to do extra things. You work shifts that mean you don't see people. You've got care work to have to do. So all these things mean that you are less likely to connect with people, right? So you're right to feel alone in it because it's made you feel alone. And years ago, not that long ago, actually, a few years ago, I had the pleasure of examining a PhD by Kate Harrison, and she was at the University of Southampton at the time. And her work was on the role that austerity has in shaping protest. And she found that people's ability to protest, not just to have the time, but to have the physical and emotional energy to engage with an issue and protest is part of the problem. And we don't see that anymore. We don't see anti-austerity protests. We don't see protests all that often about these issues, whereas we once did. And I think part of it is because that the austere condition in our daily lives affects us in that way. So I think it's important to say that, yeah, it affects the things we can buy, afford, and do, but it also just affects our ability to connect as well.
It really is a vicious cycle. You mentioned humble dreams, and I do want to talk a little bit more about that. So the term humble dreams, where did that phrase come from?
Yeah, well, for me, it's really interesting, and I can't take credit for it. So when we'd created our digital exhibition, and it had been online for a little while, and then we had a chance to display it in person. So took it for the day, got some not laptops, got some tablets and some headsets and some stands, and we displayed it at the Central Library in Manchester for a day. And some folks came along to look at it, from whether it was kind of people who planned to come and a couple of people passing by. But one person who was listening to it, we asked for their reflections to note them down afterwards. And they described people as having humble dreams. They were quite taken aback. And, these are not young people who are dreaming to be influencers or to be celebrities or sports stars. These dreams they describe to me as being humble. And that is one of the values of doing research and kind of having conversations and making it public and engaging with people, because it's not just a case of you putting it on people, you get feedback too, what other people see and hear. So for me, it felt very meaningful that somebody had engaged with those stories and had felt that about it. And it really kind of provided a language to capture something that I was struggling with, because I really wanted I really wanted to kind of think about and expand this idea of foreclosed futures. Because in a way, I don't want that to just be the end point. I don't think it's enough to say, these dreams have changed. They may not no longer be available. It leaves me feeling like, well, where does that leave us? What does that mean for us? And I think I wanted to go back to our stories and think, well, how do people talk about their dreams? What does this idea of the humble or humbleness look like? And so I went back over those stories, and particularly the 12 that we picked out, and noticed that there's like a few different elements to it, that the things people dream about have become humbled. So we might think of them as shrinking or being reshaped. That austerity itself is a humbling condition. It makes you contract. It makes you unconnected, like we were talking about. But the other thing that I really noticed, and this is the beauty of oral histories, because the recording means so much, that when I actually listened again to the way people were speaking, the language they used was humbling. So they'd talk about, yeah, maybe, but, sort of like this hedging language that then made those dreams sound even more humble. And I think for me, that's important, that we capture some of this. It might seem like it's fleeting, but it's not, because the ability to talk about how you dream really matters. And the language that we have available matters. And going back to your earlier question about, academics and background, for me, one of the things that's always struck me is the need for more work that actually incorporates the language people use to describe their own experience and their own condition. And that doesn't mean that we can't have theory and concepts, but where they come from matters. And I think thinking with the language and experience of people and centering that. So that's where the humble dreams comes from. It's very much come from engaging with what other people see. And I don't think it's a surprise to say that the person who said that was in a similar age bracket.
Yeah, yeah, I think that really hits home for me because you talk about the language using it, the hedging language. I think growing up, all my friends, we had these big dreams. We had dreams of all these things we wanted to achieve because we saw things that inspired us and we said we would get there. And over time, what it became was that the dreams, like I would tell, would kind of be they'll start using stuff like that's unrealistic, and it wouldn't be other people telling us that. It would just be ourselves kind of, self-editing these dreams in our heads. And over time, I looked around and it really does feel like we didn't have a language for why we did that. It just thought this is how the world is. This is just how it is. As you get older, your dreams will go away. But actually, like you can tell, it was, very difficult for someone, like even some of us, because some of us had like, formed our identity into achieving these dreams. And so when we trying to achieve these dreams, who are we? And I think, I often I'm very, privileged and lucky that I've been able to do some of the stuff that I wanted to do. But I think I can see with my friends, the hedging language still kind of continuing, even as they get older, it becomes more personal rather than just, I want to achieve this ambition. It's, becomes about family. It all comes about houses, I want to move to this country, but actually, what, that's maybe too far. So I must move out of home and, and I'll just live in my area. And it is a very kind of, there's an element of something being taken away,
Yeah.
and it might not be intentional, but there is an element of something being taken away, and it's very much about the language that we use. And I think so. Yeah, that kind of what you just said there, I think will really hit home for a lot of my viewers because a lot of what's happened hasn't been fully explained to us. Let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. One, I mentioned earlier about following a youth campaign, and it's an organisation that has closed down now called Reclaim. But there is another organisation from the same founder called Rekindle, where there's a real engagement with political education and what access we have to this information and why that matters. And I think that's increasingly important because we see that young people are very engaged in political debates, but having this space to learn about that, to share about that, it isn't there because our political class don't represent those views.
Yeah, I think also there's an element of there's two things at play here where at one point, there's the humbling of your dreams, but another point we're being told to accept the reality of our lives. How do we tell each of those apart? In this context of austerity, how can one tell the difference between those two?
Yeah, I mean, do you think the language of choice matters here? Because I increasingly see a language of decision making, and I'm guilty of that. I've used it before, and it never really fit. It never made sense. And it's because we're not talking about decision making. It's not a decision if you don't have different options to choose from. It's not a decision if you haven't had uh the background in something, the opportunity in something, and I think that in a way, even talking about decision making does that work of individualizing it even further.
I completely agree. And actually, on that point, we talk about decision making. One of the things I think our generations have to decide is having children and the idea of having children. And another of your study we did was stratified reproduction. I believe. Can you talk to me about that? So you obviously study how austerity shapes our decisions about having children. What did you actually find doing that?
I think one of the things I've found, and I should say that the work that I do isn't on a national scale, but it does speak to kind of people that do statistical work on a national scale. This is more looking at a person's experience day to day and in their own lives. And when we look at the depth of that, what we see is people really blame themselves. There's like a real this neoliberal language of, I've not managed this, I've not done this. So first of all, I think it's important to forefront that for those people who are very aware of structural inequalities, there's still a sense of that they haven't achieved something. But what we're seeing is that it's a mix of lots of factors. And particularly housing security is huge. People who have met somebody who would like to have a child with have talked about not being in the right accommodation. It may be they already have a child, but they would like another child and they can't because they don't feel there's enough room. The conditions of the housing are poor. They feel insecure. They don't know when they're going to get moved out, for instance. There's other situations too where people have talked about they can't move out of home. They struggle to have relationships because they can't have the intimacy they want living at a parent's home. And people they meet also live with their parents too. There's also situations where people are in shared accommodation and find it difficult to have a relationship or progress in a certain way that they'd like. So housing tends to be a really key issue that people talk about. And people just generally talk about not being in the right position, not having the things that they want, that they imagine to give a child a good life.
Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of the people that you spoke to would have said that they were relieved someone was actually researching this. What does that tell you about kind of
Yeah.
their understanding of like what's going on?
Yeah. I mean, the projects I've done where this has come up, it's really struck me, like I said, that when I've asked, I think it's always interesting to ask somebody why they took part in a project, that you always find something else out. And so they've said a lot of times that they didn't have anyone else to talk to. They didn't know anyone else was going through it. They'd never spoken to anyone else, that it was a relief. And what I've also found is that there's a lot of compassion in those spaces where people know they're sharing quite heavy, heavy stuff. And we'll say at the end, I will ask if they're okay. And they'll say, are you okay? Are you okay hearing that? And that really just, I think that is incredible that people have that real sense of knowing that the sharing of these stories is hard too. Obviously, it's not the same experiencing as listening. But there's a real sense of there be of a deep gratitude for creating that space for that to be heard. And I think that in itself is very humbling too.
No, I mean, I feel the same gratitude, honestly. I feel like there is an element of like, like the more we talk about it, the more it doesn't, doesn't take the form of something too big and too unachievable, where, it kind of gives you some calm and gives you some understanding about how to get out of this, It doesn't feel like it's an insomnia, it's too big of a mountain, And I think oftentimes these conversations get politicized, especially about children are having, my generation having children. It's like it's out of selfishness or something like that. But I think these reasons are very clear that it's not that. It's actually
Yeah,
all these things. And maybe if we pay attention to those things, then we'll see an effect where this will come back.
absolutely. And I think all for any person who says, oh, it's selfish to do that, all you have to say is look at the condition around you. Young people don't feel like they are able to, want to have a child in this context. And I think that's where the deep irony sits, where we see with a lot of right-wing politics, they're very pro-natalist, but they're also very anti-immigration. And so, okay, so you don't want one, but you want the other, but neither of those conditions is reasonable. Um, and I think we're actually going to see more of this. I think as we see a growth of a right-wing agenda
Mm-hmm.
of, yeah, I think we're going to see more pro-natalist
Yeah,
views. Yeah.
that's a bleak
Yeah.
reality. Okay, let's bring
No,
this home.
sorry.
It's no, it's fine. It's the reality. Let's bring this home. So final few questions I have is that you've kind of all these things you've talked about. These are all like big problems, and it really takes a whole, I guess, systemic societal kind of push in order to solve some of these problems. What does it mean to actually solve these problems on a policy level, but also on a human, personal level?
Yeah. I actually think the answer is in your question. So one of the realizations I've had the last few years is that the pushback from policymakers, so from politicians and others in a policy world, is all the information is out there. There are so many studies that show this, and they often gets dismissed as being anecdotal. And often it's not about the future, it's about what people are experiencing now. So I think two things need to happen. I think one, there needs to be an acknowledgement that a policy has a life, and that the moment you implement something or change something, it's going to carry on, even if you decide to reverse it, stop it, change it. That it's set the wheels in motion for something already, and there has to be an acknowledgement of that. And what might that affect? So in my view, I think there should be assessments. There should be committees that assess what might the impact of this be in a long term, not just momentarily. But perhaps more interestingly, I've also kind of really turned on this idea of presenting a particular type of a sanitized version of your research to policymakers and flipped it, because I actually think it's about listening and engaging in a human way. So the Austerity and Altered Life Courses project now, that's exactly what we're doing. So with the stories that we've collated that people generously shared, we've created a play that's going to be staged at Contact Theatre next year that is from these stories. We're co-producing some artwork with a Dutch artist. We're creating immersive events where people come and connect. And we're also doing lots of other creative kind of activities that give that space to not just collectivize and meet, but also for that human experience to be shared. Because I think that's where it lies. I think we'll make change when we get people to experience something.
And I love that you're taking it further than the study. There's oftentimes the study is just final point, but we're trying to meet people where they are, and like kind of putting into plays and all these different ways that people can understand what they're seeing and feel that and relate to that. I think that's so important. I think that really will hit home. And I think even having a conversation and explaining it, I think being able to tackle this in different directions. That's one way that that we can actually help this kind of situation. Final question then, for someone who's listening to this, maybe from my generation, from another generation, who feels a lot of themselves, who feels like a lot of what we've said applies to themselves, they experience a lot of this. What would you like them to know? What are some of the things that would be good for them to think about when it comes to this idea of foreclosed futures and austerity and humbling dreams?
That austerity is not a reflection of you, your success as a person, your ability or your worth as a human. And what I'd really ask is that you connect with someone and talk to somebody about it. And that could be somebody you know, or it could be if these issues are really affecting you, make sure that you access a support helpline. But especially talk to people, talk to friends, talk to family. You know, for me, one of the biggest one of the most important things I do is I make sure I have friends that are different generations. And that really gives me a lot of hope. I think there's a lot of wisdom and love to be shared between people of different generations and not necessarily people that you're related to.
I completely agree. And honestly, this conversation has been both informative and just heartwarming, because the way you kind of talked about these experiences and the way you found and their people and how relatable it's been for me, I think is really giving me context. Like I said at the beginning, I think it's important to have the language to describe your inner world. I think it's very important to have that. And I think having the context and the language together and understanding is something that's happened from an economic level, from a social level, and all these things have different ways, and the trickle down to happen on top of you is really good to have and really good to know. So yeah, thank you so much for speaking to me today. It's been an amazing conversation.
Thank you, Jeoffrey. Thank you
Wh-
so much.
Where can they find you? I know you've mentioned the play and exhibitions. Where can they find you doing it? Kind of continue this work.
Yep. So if you just Google Sarah Marie Hall, University of Manchester, you'll find me. And there, if you Google Austerity and Altered Life Courses, you'll also find our website. When you hit our website, you can look at all our resources. You can read a bit about us as a team, and there's also the digital exhibition on there too.
Thank you very much. Thank you for speaking to me today. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
See you next time. Bye.